I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox, and welcome to this episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the leadership journey of our guest and what unique traits bring them to be the leader they are today. Who knows what we're going to discover together, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Good morning. Well, whatever time it is, hello everybody. I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox and welcome to this episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Le Fevre today. How are you, Sarah?
I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine today. Just back from my holiday, so feeling very rested.
Oh, wonderful. So we've got the best of you today then. That's brilliant news.
I hope so, or too laid back, one or the other.
Oh, we like a bit of chill, you know. It's sometimes nice to take that moment for ourselves, and life isn't quite so manic. And I think that will resonate with everybody. Life can get a bit crazy, can't it?
It can.
I'm loving the background of books. I noticed
they're board games. Those are my games.
Are they all games? Of course they are. I should have matched.
Yeah, that was my DIY project last summer. And I've got to build another shelf or set of shelves around about the same size to accommodate the rest, but I haven't got around to it yet.
Fantastic. Well, without giving the game away, I will just give you an official introduction so that everybody knows who we are chatting to today. Now, Sarah, my best understanding of what you do is helping people, leaders, teams to discover how games-based learning can work for them and their team. Would that be a fair description?
Pretty much, yes. Yeah. Although probably, well, this will probably come out in the interview, but my sort of understanding and my sort of definition of what is a game has sort of expanded somewhat over my practice. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear. Hold that thought, because when we get together next week for your second episode, we're going to chat all about your take on games and leadership. Now, of course, because of what games is going to come into this episode, and I'm sure the last episode as well, but you know, in terms of that sort of leadership games and things and how you perceive all of that, we'll definitely cover in the middle episode. So Sarah, what we love to do in our first episode with our guests is chat to them really about your journey to date, you know, because we're all leading ourselves, of course, and whilst we see leadership in the traditional way that people think of immediately that comes to mind, which is that, oh, I'm leading a team or I'm leading something in an organization. You know, when you have your own business, you're also leading yourself and your business. We're leading ourselves through life. There's so many different connotations. So what we'd love to hear is your story today. That would be great. Over to you.
So the background should give you some kind of a clue. Sort of everything that I do currently, and pretty much the whole sort of path of my sort of working life has been somewhat flavoured by play and games. I've played games ever since I was a very small child. Some of my earliest memories of playing card games with sort of my parents and my grandparents and so on. And when I left university, I first of all, I was working in sort of IT and computing, and kind of fell into the training aspect of that. So sort of fell into learning, if you like, as many people who work in learning do. They discover they enjoy that. And because of my love of play and my love of games, it was inevitable that I would always start to bring those kind of aspects into what I did. But way back then, it was quite a long time ago, games-based learning, I don't think that the term even existed then, certainly not for adults. And certainly I would say at that stage, I was injecting small bits of play and little games into what I was doing, but I wouldn't say I was doing games-based learning at all. As time went on, the whole games-based learning thing got a little bit more respectable, I guess, got a bit more mature. Although I would say there's still a lot of maturing to go on in the games-based learning space. So gradually over time, more and more play came into what I was doing, and now when I lead a session, the play is the work. It's not sort of, I don't tend to do the games-based learning that a lot of other people do, whereas you play a small game and then you do a big debrief. So it's kind of that kind of way of going about it. It's kind of where I was back then. And it was sort of enhanced chalk and talk, I suppose. But now I like to create experiences where people can get totally immersed in playing, and through that play they do the work. So yes, I guess my journey also has been a journey of the topics that I deal with. So as I say, I started out in sort of IT training, and as a result of that, I had at one point I became self-employed, and I had one big client, which was a bit scary, only having one client. But I did such a lot of work for them that was kind of how it worked out. I was a one-man band anyway, and one day I was doing a lot of work with them, teaching their staff how to use their intranet, and a lot of that was around helping people to write web pages and create graphics and so on. So I was doing a lot of work with and this shows how long ago it was, Dreamweaver. For anybody who's into web design, you'll realize how long ago that was, and Photoshop and other image software. And one day the guy who was kind of my contact within the organization said, "Oh, we want to do some more sort of soft skills stuff, but it's also around a major new software rollout that we're doing, and I'd like you to help me put it together, because I don't think I can do it on my own, and I'd like you to come on tour with me around the UK." It was going to be about a 6-week sort of going here, there and everywhere around all their sites in the UK. I'd like you to come with me and help me to roll this out. I said, "Oh, okay." It was sort of, at that point, it would have been the sort of biggest project that I've ever been involved in. And so that was the point where I really got into sort of design, I guess, learning design as opposed to learning delivery, because up until then it had been turn up, do 4 hours, go away. Same thing, day in, day out sort of thing. Different software, but more or less the same kind of structure. And so I got to thinking about how I could make this interesting for myself and the people who I was going to be training. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up creating for the core of the learning, there was a game around creating a hit record. So that was the kind of premise of the game. So people had to decide how they were going to go about putting this together. Were they going to put a band together? Were they going to sort of like sit in a studio and just get lots of electronics going on and just whatever? So they had to, as a team, create this hit record. And that was kind of, I guess at that stage, that was where I kind of pivoted over into games-based learning, in that the kind of percentage of play to, telling people what they needed to know, knowledge transfer, I suppose, kind of pivoted to more than 50% play. So I went off and I did that, and really that's where I've kind of ended up now, except that because it was more soft skills, that also represented a shift in the topics that I was dealing with. So I then sort of got far more into things like teamwork, and over time into leadership as well. And for quite a long period of time, I was sometimes I was self-employed, sometimes I was working for somebody else. and I was doing a lot of work that was around the kind of traditional corporate learning kind of focus, I suppose. A lot of it was around, well, the usual corporate goal, making more money. But after a while, I got I got a little bit.
If only they focused on, improving their team, giving them the best
Yes. But
opportunities, the
ultimately,
money would follow, wouldn't it?
yes. Ultimately, the goal was around, making more money. And I must admit, I found that a little bit dissatisfying. And on certain occasions that you would find yourself, I'm sure it's happened to a lot of people if they're in the learning space, you find yourself being asked to do something that doesn't quite fit in with your values quite often. And I had a few of those moments. It was around helping people to, I won't name any names, but helping people to do things that weren't particularly congruent with my values, because that's how they saw their business working. And so another of my sort of big focuses, I guess, outside of work has always been the environment and nature, which was something that was drilled into me very young. I had an outstanding head teacher in my primary school who used to take us all on nature walks every week. Every class, she used to take them once a week. And this is why I can recognise birds and trees. And my husband just goes, "How on earth would you know that?" And it was just like, "Oh, Mrs. Judson." So the environment's always been a big focus of mine. So I made a big pivot from moving in the sort of, from working in the sort of, I guess, business games space into more for good focused work. So generally speaking, the environment, big systemic problems, things like I guess organizational culture, systemic racism, and so on. Those started to be the things that I focused on, and that's where I am now, creating games that help people sort of get to grips with those issues, those really complex issues, sort of simple issues, but not easy ones, I guess, as a way. We all know what we need to do for the environment, but it's not easy to do it.
You're absolutely right, Sarah. There is so much we can and should be doing, but so much that we don't do yet. And helping each other to open our minds and eyes about the possibilities, is part of helping each other grow and learn. And the fact that you're talking about how you pivoted more into that sort of, I don't know if I use the right word here, holistic space, softer skill, things that really, it sounds to me like, issues that really matter, but helping people look at them differently. I mean, as you were talking, Sarah, my brain is exploding with with fascination as to how your brain works. And I remember talking to our mutual friend Darren Sweet when he came on the podcast last year, and just sitting there like I've just done with you now, thinking, how do you get your brain to work all of this stuff out? Because I know that the games that he creates with Ipso card decks, digital card decks and what have you, to support team games and so on, are just fascinating and so creative, and help people to really look at something that could be quite mundane, in terms of getting the team to gel together, for example. Or trust each other, which for me isn't mundane. I think it's fascinating, and I love getting underneath all of that. But how do you make that really creative into some sort of game that makes sense? So a little bit of your sort of thought process would be really shared. Well, it's fascinating.
Therein lies a tale. My brain is quite an interesting thing, or has become quite an interesting thing over the past few years, because one of the things that I've kind of quite recently discovered about myself is that I have ADHD. And I think it's amazing, actually, because I know a lot of people in the games-based learning space, a lot of people in the games design space, and it is amazing how many of us there are in there. And I think a lot of it is around the fact that it's one of those areas in which people with ADHD can be happy working, because one thing that's completely sort of debilitating, and I found it debilitating over my working life in various jobs that I've been in, is lack of novelty. So designing games and working out how you're going to sort of take some learning outcomes that you've been briefed with and so on, and create those into a meaningful and fun and engaging game experience is new every day. It's every time it's different. So I think that's probably why I meet a lot of people exactly like myself in this space. So that's kind of how my brain works, but that's different from the creative process of how I actually do it. So again, I think the ADHD thing is very interesting in this space, is because we are sort of sponges for absolutely everything that comes along. In a lot of cases, it looks like distraction, and it can be distraction, and that can be quite debilitating. But also it means that potentially everything that you see, hear, smell is going to capture your attention in some way, is going to sort of trigger something. And I think one of the other things is, the older you get, the more connections you've potentially got in that brain, and the way those sort of inspirations, those distractions almost, are going to trigger something off. I'll give you an example. So my husband is long used to sort of the way my brain works and so on. When he'll constantly send me little snippets of information, he'll read something, he'll go, "Oh, Sarah will be interested in that," which is almost everything. And he'll send it to me. And so he sent me one. This was about a year and a half ago or so. He sent me a snippet out of The Guardian. So it sort of popped up in my email middle of the working day, about fungi, and about how they have a vocabulary of 50 words, which this was like the headline, newspaper headlines being what they are. So, this sounds interesting. So basically what it amounted to was that a group of researchers had been doing some work with large mycelium, so sort of like really big, widespread networks of fungi in forests. And what they discovered is that in the presence of a stimuli or a stimulus or a threat, say disease or attack by some kind of pest, insects or being nibbled by whatever, that electrical impulses would start to sort of move around the mycelium. Very, very weak electrical impulses, but they had obviously, very, very sensitive measuring equipment.
Yeah.
And they worked out that the fungi or the mycelium was communicating. So if there was a threat, there would be information about this threat would be passed to the other end of the mycelial network, and action would be taken. And so they started looking into this a bit more closely, and they worked out there were about 50 different kinds of communication. So it was almost like they had this sort of mycelial network had 50 different words that they could that could be used to talk about various things. So there's a game in this. There's got to be a game in this. And this quite often happens. This is sort of typical, that something like that, an idea will sort of come along like that, and it will just start me working on something. So I had a play with it, and I got a few people together, and I came up with a rough prototype. And we discovered as we were playing through it and playing with other people and sort of prototyping and rapid prototyping and trying my ideas out on other people is a really important part of what I do. I don't think I'd be able to create games without doing that. So we came up with this game whereby a team would get together. And first of all, they'd have to find each other. So if you imagine a game of battleships, it's a little bit like that at the beginning. So if you imagine the first phase of the game is a little bit like that. Haven't quite ironed out all the kinks in it yet, because there are various sort of gameplay problems which sound quite simple when you talk about them, but are not easy to work out. But fundamentally, they first of all have to grope around in the dark. These different fungi, they have to grope around in the dark to find each other, to join the mycelium. Once they've joined the mycelium, they can start communicating with each other. There's also food lying around, which they might find when they're groping around in the dark. And once they're connected with another mushroom, this isn't quite how mycelium and mushrooms work in the real world, so, as a fungi specialist told me, but it's good enough for the game. They can then start suggesting words. So what happens is those that are connected will start to suggest words, and they'll start to agree on words that the whole mycelium will be able to use. But you've only got 50, and the game ends when the 50 words have been established. So what happens is what happens in organisations. The people who are already there, the people who are in there from the start, they get the chance to establish the culture being represented by the things you can actually talk about. You've also got all sorts of situations. I'm sorry about my cat.
That's all right. He's having a good old chat, joining in. So you carry on, Sarah.
Yeah, he's the loudest cat in the world. I do apologise. And so the people who are there first get a chance to establish the culture. They get a chance to establish what words are going to be used. Also, the food. When you find food, you have a choice. You can either take all the food for yourself, because only you know about it, or you can leave some food there so that the other people in there, or the other fungi in the mycelium, will find it and they will also prosper. So there's all that stuff about resources and that empire building thing. So very soon on, I went, oh, this is an organizational culture game. There's so much in here. And with very, very simple tweaks as well, like the food thing. That was a very, very simple tweak when I made the decision that you could either, that you don't have to reveal that you found food. You can take it all for yourself if you want. You've then got the situation as quite early on, the group realizes that there are certain words that they're going to need to have in the culture for the mycelium to survive at all. So they're going to need words that will help them to ask for food, ask other mushrooms for food, talking about direction is a big one, obviously, because they're groping around. So having words about direction is going to be quite important. But then you find that some people they recognize that those words are necessary, but they're unwilling to waste their sort of quota of words on those mundane housekeeping words when they want to talk about, I don't know, they want to talk about money, or they want to talk about progress or whatever. They need those words, and they don't want to use up their quota on these housekeeping words. And it's like a really, really interesting thing. Yeah. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this inspiration is everywhere. And I think the way my creative process tends to work is that I just let my intuition guide me to something that interests me, because I've learned to trust that my instinct is recognizing interesting things because they've got potential, which is, and again, that's quite fun, and it's something that works very well with the ADHD brain, because you're giving yourself permission to follow your interest, rather than forcing yourself to do something because you should do it. So that seems to be a creative process that works very well for me, and as I say, for a lot of other people I know as well.
Yeah. Oh, what a fascinating insight into just one small part of what's become a really amazing, incredible journey that you've created for yourself, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and I absolutely can't wait to hear or to chat to you next week in terms of how you're thinking about games in leadership some more. what that means to you, what it sort of triggers in your mind when you think about that. So we will hold those thoughts for next week. But thank you so much for today. Go give the cat a cuddle, because he's
will.
good until just now. And we'll chat to you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. Today, we listen to the leadership journey of our guest and how they got to be where they are today. Now, in the chats, we talked about all sorts of different things, and there are lots of bits and pieces in there that are going to mean something different to each and every one of you. You'll all have your own unique takeaways, so I encourage you to do a bit of reflection now and see what this might mean for your leadership moving forwards. I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox, and I look forward to seeing you on Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders, next week. Bye for now.